So our story actually starts at a coffee shop.
Waited till I saw the sun.
No, not that kind of coffee shop. It's a coffee shop in Brownsville, Texas in the late 1800s. It was July 13, 1859, and there was a guy who was drunk. He's a local farmhand. He was being really loud and disruptive and just bothering customers. The owner wanted the man out of her shop, so she sent a little boy across town to go get Marshall Shears, and he's the sheriff of the town. So Marshall Shears arrives at the coffee shop. A confrontation between the two erupts, and the marshal knocks the guy to the ground. And he pulls the guy out of the coffee shop through the front door and onto the dirt road. And it just so happens that this guy by the name of Juan Cortina is riding down the streets on his horse, and he sees that Marshall Shears has a Mexican-American man on the ground. And Marshall Shears hits the ranch hand over the head with his gun. Juan Cortina sees this and says,
there's another case of the gringos coming in and treating Mexicanos and Latinos badly.
Eugene Fernandez with the Brownsville Historical Association. After Juan Cortina saw this, he raised his gun and shot into the air. Juan Cortina demanded that the marshal hand over the ranch hand, who it turns out used to be a former worker of Juan Cortina. The marshal refused to do so, and then Juan Cortina points his gun towards Marshall Shears, and Marshall Shears does the same, and they both fire. Marshall Shears missed. Juan Cortina ends up shooting Marshall Shears on the arm. And according to some people that I spoke to, the Mexican Americans in the community that were witnessing this exchange happen between the two people, they were cheering on Juan Cortina for what had just happened. Juan Cortina grabs his former ranch hand and they take off, promising vengeance on the city. For Juan Cortina, enough was enough.
He in particular was objecting to a clique of lawyers and judges in Brownsville.
History professor Jerry Thompson from Texas A&M University.
Who were using the courts to seize parts of land grants.
Basically, Mexican Americans were being cheated out of their land. A lot of the trials at the time were very biased. A majority of the courts and the jurors were comprised of Anglos. Land disputes were creating a tense situation in Texas, and one of the people impacted by these disputes was Juan Cortina.
The traditional view of Cortina is this wild, red-bearded guy with a big sombrero on, shooting up the Texas countryside.
Him having a red beard was kind of a myth. It's not really true. But he was a landowner, and his family owned land on both the U.S. side of the border and on the Mexican side of the border as well.
Okay, so Juan Cortina rides off and says, vengeance. But then what happens?
So he started assembling an army of Tejanos. Cortina's ranch became the headquarters and a gathering place. Here's Thompson again.
Anybody that was poor, that had been mistreated, that had been discriminated against, they were very likely to join this guy. Some of them came with barefooted. It was just a means of striking back at the establishment that had mistreated them for a number of years.
So about 2 months after the coffee shop incident, Juan Cortina managed to get a group of about 80 people, and they laid siege on the town of Brownsville. He issued a proclamation. They, as Mexican Americans, had the right to rebel and had the right to self-preservation because of all the atrocities that were happening to them and the discrimination that was taking place at that time. And after the proclamation, a lot of the raids began.
You talk about the raids that were happening. So were they bloody? What was happening in those raids?
Yeah, I've been told that they would go onto Anglo ranches and kill Anglos. It got pretty violent, and eventually Juan Cortina and his army captured all of Brownsville.
Well, when Cortina raided Brownsville in 1859, this sent shockwaves all the way to Austin, sent shockwaves all the way to Washington, D.C. People in Texas could just not understand how this Mexican, quote, bandit could seize a whole town and hold it.
This essentially started a war known as the Cortina Wars. Because of that, they sent Texas Rangers down to the Rio Grande Valley to take care of Cortina and his men.
Is that code for Texas Rangers were brought in to basically take down anybody who was resisting?
Yeah, basically. The Texas Rangers were being instructed to get rid of Juan Cortina by by any means possible, but Juan Cortina actually beat the Texas Rangers twice. Professor Thompson gives a perspective into what the military dynamics were in the valley at the time.
And the military in Texas had made the mistake of shifting all the troops who were stationed on the river here on the border out to fight Indians in West Texas. And there was no military to speak of at that time who could do anything about what he was wanting to do.
Since the Texas Rangers couldn't fight off Juan Cortina, the U.S. State Department had to get involved. They ended up sending U.S. Army troops to the border to take him down, and between both the Rangers and the Army, Juan Cortina had no chance but to flee to Mexico. Juan Cortina did not win the war, but he made it very clear that Mexican landowners were not going to go down without a fight.
So is it kind of like with Juan Cortina, he became the symbol of the person who stood up and said, "No más, se acabó"?
I mean, yeah, pretty much. He became this iconic figure. Andres Tijerina is a history professor from Austin Community College, and he compares Cortina to a lot of other popular American heroes.
And he protested very much like Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, George Washington. He declared that these Mexican American citizens had rights to defend themselves.
In Mexico, Juan Cortina ended up getting imprisoned.
Why was he imprisoned in Mexico?
Well, he was still crossing the border and raiding homes and ranches and stealing cattle, so the U.S. government had to put pressure on Mexico to arrest him. Today, Juan Cortina is kind of known as a controversial figure, but a lot of people consider him a hero.
And defeating the Texas Rangers then made Cortina a real hero on the border because there was so much resentment of the Rangers at that time. The Rangers were basically racist to no end.
But unfortunately, Juan Cortina's story has kind of also been forgotten. I met a guy by the name of Tony Zavaleta. He's a professor of anthropology at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. He and I talked at a restaurant.
I was driving around Brownsville with my favorite uncle, Prajedes Oribe. The name Cortina came up and he said, "Well, you know, he's our relative." And I said, "What? What do you mean he's our relative?" "Oh, sure, he's my mother's grandfather, your grandmother's grandfather." I said, "Why the hell don't I know that? Why don't I know that? Why don't we talk about that? Why don't we honor that?"
It's like being related to Davy Crockett and not knowing about it.
What do you think of Juan Cortina now? I mean, is he a hero for you? Is he a villain? Is he to be celebrated or to be scorned?
Yeah, so I'm not really sure where I stand with Juan Cortina. I see both sides. I can respect Juan Cortina for rising up against the establishment and standing up to injustices. I just don't really like that he did so through violent acts. But then the other part of me is just like, well, maybe that's what was needed at the time. No matter what I think, there will always be negative feelings towards Juan Cortina. Eugene Fernandez of the Brownsville Historical Association actually feels that Juan Cortina made things in Texas worse.
If there was anybody that was responsible for the killing of more Mexicans in South Texas during this colonial period, other than Juan Cortina, I don't know who it is. He was the reason that the Rangers were brought in.